Welcome, and thank you for joining Inside the CISO's office. I'm the producer, Lance Hart. Today, we're going to talk about navigating cybersecurity funding and legal risks. We have a couple special guests. John, I'm going to turn it over to you for introductions. Let's jump right in.
Great. Thanks so much, Lance. Hi, I'm John Bruggeman. I'll be the host for this Inside the CISO's office. And with me today is Allan Hackney and Jim Studer. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves to the audience and let them know what you've done over the past, 10 or 20 years, whatever you want to tell us. Allan, let's start with you, and then Jim, you'll be next.
Oh, thanks, John, and I'm very happy to join you today. Currently, I have a portfolio of things keeping me busy, independent director on 3 bank boards, some nonprofits. I do some thesis advising for Northeastern and some executive coaching, but that follows on a long career as CIO, the GE, Bank of America, AIG, and John Hancock.
That'll keep you busy. Very good. Appreciate that. Thank you, Allan. And Jim, what have you been up to?
Oh, I just kind of hang out. But in any case, I was a long time CIO for Univision television business. But before that, long history in GE. Started in IT when we talked about security like once a week. And before I was done as a CIO, we talked about it in every single topic, if not every single sentence. So it went from kind of a far off thing to something that was absolutely directly in your face every second of every day.
And that's a perfect segue, because obviously cybersecurity risk has become a hot topic for boards. It's now a topic for the SEC and the FTC. So the federal government is very interested in making sure companies focus and pay attention to cybersecurity. But there's a question that Jim, you and I have talked about several times, is how do people get the funding for cybersecurity initiatives? And that's one of the 2 topics. So cybersecurity funding and legal risks. So let's start with, securing the funding for cybersecurity projects. What are some effective strategies that either one of you have used to get funding for cybersecurity projects over your career? And Jim, we'll start with you, and then Allan will move to you.
It's an interesting problem in that, obviously this all spun off from or was specialized from, the classic CIO activities. And the first thing that I think is important to recognize is every entity you deal with is going to be at a different place on the learning curve. So if you're in a mature organization and they know all this stuff, it's a very different problem than if you're bringing up something for the first time. I noticed the topic is, I just noticed this a few minutes ago, is projects. Well, projects are fine if the entity you're dealing with, if they don't understand the strategy or the problem or the lay of the land, all you can really do is bring up a project at one time, hopefully in the regular budget cycle, and pitch that as a good, doable thing. Over time, you'd like them to raise their level of maturity so you can actually begin to pull back and talk a little more strategy and longer term. But when you're day 0, you're on a project by project, maybe even month by month or quarterly basis. So recognize where you're at and respond accordingly.
That makes sense. So, identify the maturity of the organization that you're leading and work from that point forward.
Yes.
And then Allan, what's been your experience for getting funding for projects?
To Jim's point about maturity, the ideal is your business recognizes that your ability to manage risk, particularly cyber risk in this case, is in fact a business enabler and allows you to do the things that you need to do. That argument, in my experience, falls flat almost all the time. What does work is to examine where inability to perform the functions that your particular business does could be impacted directly by a cyber event, and appealing to those traits and those desires that people have depending what industry, in the banking industry, to avoid regulatory problems, in a brand managed business to avoid brand reputation damage in the healthcare space to avoid the loss of healthcare data. It's really trying to understand where risks and again, in this case, cybersecurity, where risk could impede your ability to compete and to be profitable and to prosper. That's been my experience in terms of gaining people's attention and trust to fund projects.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found in the 20 plus years that I ran my own shop was that I had to change the language I used. It didn't do me any good to talk about, oh, this is a really great next generation firewall, or to toss out acronyms that the CFO, and that's who I typically reported to, was the CFO. They didn't really care what the technology was. Their goal was for us to continue to operate as a business. And what I had to do was explain it in the context of risk. Like, hey, here's a risk that we're facing. If we don't spend this money on this project, this risk is either going to get bigger or it's going to occur, whatever I'm trying to prevent. And then we're not going to be able to do what we're supposed to do. So that was the strategy that I employed, was changing my language and talking about it in the context of risk. And that's what I heard you say, Allan. And Jim, I think the maturity piece is incredibly important, because there's a variety of maturities out there for organizations.
100%. And if you can't match up with your communication and your whole approach with their maturity, you might as well be just talking to yourself, is all that it is. And you'll know if you're matching up, when you see that human, responsive cognition, then you're in the game. Until then, you're not even in the game. So match up.
So you're saying read your audience and play to the audience. If they're zoned out, you're not communicating.
It's an old story, but it's still true. Yes.
Well, Jim is saying in different words the very point that I just made, which is, you got to understand where the heart and drive of your business leadership is, and you have to speak to them in those terms. If you don't, you're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things we have here also is, what are some of the common challenges and objections that either the CFO or, if you're reporting up to somebody else, maybe the COO might have for a project. And typically, in my experience, it's always been, there's no budget for that new project that I'm trying to launch, in a sense. And Allan, what has been the thing that you typically ran into in terms of challenges to get funding?
In any company, you're competing for capital, right? To do a project. And if you can't demonstrate business value and economic benefit from the pursuit of whatever initiative that you're proposing, you're never going to win, right?
Got to have the ROI.
You got to have the ROI. And, I can't tell you how many projects I've seen fail to even get past the first toll gate, because they talk about the tools, or they talk about the problem in technobabble, and there's no linkage to how their products are going to be better, the business, and so forth. That's it's got to be tied back to the ROI and the business value.
Yeah. What are you going to do for me, Jim?
Yeah, a lot of it also depends on who you're talking to. If it's a CFO, they're going to have a different kind of way to understand the money versus the COO, or, at Univision, we had, in essence, a budget committee. And so they had their own personality, plugging into their mindset and how they allocated money. Because, there's an infinite number of good ideas for an enterprise to spend money on, infinite number. So you have to get up in the queue. And if you're not really the sharpest guy in the meeting to describe what you're going to be doing in the language of the people you're talking to, they've got 100 other really great projects they can do. So
right,
you got
somebody might be making a better business case.
Well, you got to be really, really better at talking through it and demonstrating it in numbers than anyone else in that room. And that means work, work, work.
Okay. And that segues nicely into the next topic that we had talked about was, if you're navigating the C-suite, here you are, you're maybe an early CISO, maybe you're the director of IT security, and you are reporting up to, maybe you're going to report up to the COO. So that's one, viewpoint into the business, or you're going to you're reporting up to the CFO. Allan, from your perspective, when you and I talked about it, you said the COO was probably the right person to, to partner with in a sense. Is that the way you feel for most cybersecurity projects? It's the COO?
COO or the business president or the division general manager. It's the ultimate business leader whose business is at risk because of a cyber event. You and I talked a little bit about COO versus CFO. Look, the CFO or the CFO's designate has to have their fingerprints over all aspects of how the business case was developed, where the investment is coming from, how the return was calculated. If you don't go into the discussion with your designated finance officer sitting next to you, it's going to be a long, long discussion, right?
Or a really short one.
Yeah.
Or a really short one. Yes, yeah. Exactly. And you can't separate the finances from the rest of the business, right? They have to go hand in glove. In some cases, the CFO is ultimately your decision maker, and that's fine. I would say in that case, I would bring the business person with me and have the business person nodding their head. You can't be debating the facts here. Everybody's got to have the same point of view.
That makes sense.
Yep.
And Jim, when you and I talk, we typically said it, get to know the CFO. And where would you stand on that?
No matter what else, the CFO will have a major, major voice on where the money goes. So, and you can get the COO on board, and that's great. You can get other people on board. But at the end, the CFO has major control over where the money goes. So you got to have that person, and as well as at least one other business person. Something we haven't talked about is, even our pre-discussions, was chief legal counsel. I think that can also be a big, big way to kind of force your way into a serious discussion. Although I've never seen a chief legal counsel do too much in the budget meeting, but they can certainly lay groundwork for that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I try to always describe new projects in the context of reducing risk. And in my experience, the CFO wants to reduce risk and the compliance folks want to reduce risk. Sometimes it's so that they can, still afford insurance, so you have less exposure. But you also obviously have to engage the business, either the business unit that you're trying to, apply particularly security control to, or what have you. And then, is there any advice that you might have for, a CISO who's fairly new to the role, to approach the executives in those conversations? Is it a social approach? Is it a, casual approach? Is it a formal approach with a PowerPoint and, 27 slides? Who wants to go first, Jim or
Al? Go ahead.
Whether it's a CISO or, frankly, anyone in the general IT space, I think you have to spend upfront time to go into the leadership that you're supporting with your mouth closed and your ears open. I think you got to go in and you got to ask them, what are your challenges? What's keeping you up at night? Where is the business impeded by one thing or another? I mean, you got to go in and you got to, if you're going to be a partner to these people, you need to walk in their shoes. And the only way you're going to do that, in my opinion, is you got to go in and you got to say, I'm here to understand. Help me understand what your challenges are. I think if you can do that and you can do that effectively, they're going to tell you, and you'll find out pretty darn quick where the issues are.
Yeah. So listen first, ask questions, but listen. Don't talk so much.
Well, as Stephen Covey says, seek to understand before you seek to be understood.
Yes.
Yep. And
Jim?
in those discussions, my experience has been it'll start off typically with some hurt. Okay, they're experiencing some immediate pain, and it may sound kind of trivial, but that's your entry point to say, if nothing else, say, yeah, I think we can make that better, right? Hardly more than a nuisance, but it's an important nuisance to them. Take that one little thing, make some good progress. Then you have legitimacy to go back and say, hey, that seems to be better. I think, do you see it as being better too? And given that that's true, now you've earned some immediate credibility. And now you can talk about the bigger things beyond, just the rock in the shoe that the guy had that particular day you talked to them.
Yeah, because it could be something as simple as MFA. People are like, I'm annoyed by using MFA, and then find a way to reduce the friction in that regard. Go ahead, Allan.
I think of it a little differently. I think about business leaders who look at CISO, much like they do the compliance function, as the people that are there to say no on things that they want to do. Right. And
Captain No.
Captain No, yeah, Dr. No, right? And you can't avoid the preconceived notion, but you can get past the preconceived notion by doing what Jim said, and along the lines of what I said. It's like, you're here to partner. You're here to make them better, right? And you convey that to them. Yes, sooner or later, you're probably going to put in MFA, and they rather put a stick in their eye than do that. You need to convince them that you're on their team. You're there to help them.
Yeah. And that is a potential journey that might take more than one conversation, because they could have a bit of experience with a prior, leader in IT security that was Captain No, and virtually that's how everybody viewed him. And if you come into that new role, they may see you in that same light, and that can be a bit of an effort to overcome.
Well, if you do what Jim suggested, which is say, I think I can help you, and then you actually do, that break down the barrier.
Yeah.
I'm flashing back. One of our key leaders at Univision, he came in at 7:30 in the morning. This was in Midtown, and I did too. And so it was a really great little habit just to swing by his office. Not every day, but let's say twice a week, and say, well, how's it going, right? And you would get, until you had that initial real credibility, you would get some pretty crazy things like, well, I got this report and I really want to move the column over, right? I go, well, okay, we can do that. So, but that, it isn't like a one-time event. And I think Al's alluding to this too. It isn't a one-time thing. It's relationships come over time. Sometimes, different people you'll connect with more quickly or more slowly. That's not really the issue, but it's that you pound away on it every day, and they'll find that you can help them. And at that point, it really becomes, I hate to use the word easy, but it's easy. Right? Tom knew I was on his side, and he was on my side. And so it was easy to do, but you had to spend the time. In this case, it was 7:30, at least 2 days a week, just swinging by his office. How's it going, Tom? And he'd have something almost always to say, because when I started at Univision, they were absolutely nowhere in technology. So the well was very deep.
Got it. Well, that segues pretty nicely into some legal risks and the regulatory compliance map. So as Allan, you're still in the business, as it were, working on boards. What is it that boards see or are concerned about from a regulatory or legal risk standpoint?
Oh, the list. How long do we have here on this show?
We have about 3.5 more. No, I'm just kidding. We have a few more minutes, so feel free to hit the high notes.
Yeah, it'll depend on industry, of course, because some industries are more highly regulated than others. For example, some industries have a lot more geopolitical risk, than others, and so forth. But from the board's point of view, it's all about what are the impediments, the potential liabilities, the potential gotchas that could undermine the business strategy and undermine, frankly, just the business's ability to conduct the work that they do, right? And I'm on the boards of some banks, and this is a highly regulated environment. I can tell you that the risk committee on these bank boards probably occupies half of the entire time that the board spends discussing things, which would include the business strategy, the financials, and so forth. At least half is spent there. And I think back on the work I did with the state of Connecticut in healthcare, compliance and risk, again, at least half. And you can probably appreciate the plight of a CISO in the healthcare space, where the docs all want to go get the latest proton device, and you're over there trying to convince these doctors that you need to spend time in security. You got to bring it, you got to bring it back to the risks of the business.
Definitely. Jim?
Well, I think there's also a margin there. As Al said, it's the risk. And I think you need to categorize the risk, right? I mean, in the worst case, for the entity, it could be a go to jail issue, right? In the worst of the worst cases. And you don't want to pull that arrow out of your quiver very often, but you certainly need to be alert to it, so that when it is applicable, you say it, and you say it clearly. The next layer down would be, well, it's only business threatening, so and so on. So kind of having that gradient in your head at all times and operating on it. As I said earlier, every sentence that, someone in these high-level technical positions, you have to have in the back of your head, how does privacy and security play in here? There's no sentence you can't say without have that operating in your head. And part of that is calibrating it. Is this on one extreme? Oh, we don't want to be embarrassed, all the way to business threatening, or in the worst case, someone needs to think about not going to jail.
Yeah. I had a conversation this morning with some CIOs in the Cincinnati area, and I wasn't making a big deal out of having a data retention policy, but the one person really, hung on to that. Like, that's a really good starting point. I'm like, yes, I'm thinking most people in this room have a data retention policy. And then somebody else, these are all CIOs, they said, well, but not everybody follows it. And I said, well, that will send you to jail if you're not careful. So if you've got a policy, you better follow it. And we've got two other possible questions here. We've got a couple more minutes. So what strategies did you tend to utilize, or did you try to utilize, to mitigate any kind of liabilities or ensure that you have compliance? Other than perhaps, I guess, inviting the general counsel to all of your meetings. Jim, you want to go first, or do you want to think about it for a moment?
I'd like Al to go first, so I have a chance to think. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I take a classic approach on that question. I always think about a process that categorizes the potential risks that could impact your business. You create what's known as a risk register. Very traditional.
I'm very familiar. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But as a part of that, it's, doing a proper assessment of your vulnerability to the risk, the frequency that risk could happen, and then ultimately the impact, right? And if you do a thoughtful exercise on that, you should be able to categorize, the primary risks to your business in a pretty straightforward way. And then you can have a thoughtful conversation around, do I just stop doing the stuff that's a very high impact risk? Do I mitigate it by transferring the risk
with insurance
of a climate event or something to an insurance company? Do I invest in the infrastructure or change the processes to to further mitigate the risk that we're going to continue to carry. It's got to be a thoughtful process, though, along those lines. And oh, by the way, once and done is not the answer. It's got to be a living document.
Yeah, your risk register should be updated at least on an annual basis, and maybe every 6 months, depending on your environment or how often you're adding a new technology to your infrastructure. And that new, let's call it a sonogram device for a hospital, and it's going to connect up to a cloud service provider. Well, where's the vulnerability? Is the vulnerability on the sonogram device connecting into your other infrastructure, or is it the cloud connection? Yeah, you have to have a thoughtful conversation about that.
Yeah.
Jim.
It isn't strictly cybersecurity, but I think it's a good example. The chief risk officer and I were trying to convince the guys down in Miami about their hurricane risk. And until we put the one page together that showed a Cat 5 hurricane approaching Miami, all we did was take Andrew and move it like 4 miles north. That's all we had to do on the diagram. Their idea that one building could back up the other building was utter nonsense, because the scope of the hurricane was like, I don't know,
300,
1,000 times bigger than the distance between those two buildings. Okay.
Yeah, that's where you want geographic distance between your backup and your primary.
But the point was, the chief risk officer had worked years trying to communicate, this truth, right? And until he came across this one diagram, he was just talking to himself. So this goes back to the work. You got to put your brain into someone else's brain, and then let it wander around in there until you come up with not just an interesting argument, but a compelling argument.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I think some people might be tempted to, particularly if they're starting off fairly early in their career, they might be tempted to think that there's a silver bullet or a special phrase. I mean, not that it's a secret handshake or anything like that, but this takes effort. This takes work on their part to, like you say, listen, seek to understand before you're trying to make yourself understood, and to, like you said, Jim, put yourself in their shoes to see, oh, you're asking me to contribute this to your budget, and I'm going to take away, I'm going to make up a number, $500,000 out of my budget to offset a risk that I don't think is really present. That's going to take some conversations.
Yep. And good ones too, not just shallow ones, very, very deep ones.
The last one in the legal risks and regulatory compliance section. So some strategies for mitigating the liabilities and ensuring compliance. Do you have any? No, this might be something where you actually have a go-to strategy for limiting or mitigating liabilities. Just curious. Allan?
Well, we talked just a minute ago about using your risk register to sort of categorize things. You don't need to fix every single thing on that risk register. I think the key here, right, is to figure out, are you doing a process for, we talked about insurance. Okay, fine, you can transfer the risk, but just think about processes that you're doing in-house. And do you need to do those processes, or can you give those processes to a third party who is specializing in that and probably scale way more than you have, and probably has all the routines and the compliance functions and so forth along. It's an example of in the experience. You may be doing something because you've been doing it for 1,000 years, and this is the way we do it. But if you ask yourself, do I really need this? Is this a differentiator for me? Or can I give it to somebody who gets up on Monday morning saying, I need to be the best there is in this particular process? Give it over to them, right? And then keep the things that are differentiated.
Right. And special to your business, for sure.
Special to your business, yeah.
I think that's a great point. I mean, if you just look at all the, major entities now, third-party entities that have all these different huge software and hardware, support platforms for cybersecurity. the idea that you could take on that is just like nuts, right? But you got to pick the right vendor, and and I understand that's very easy to say, very hard to do, but you're going to have to do that. That's a whole other process that we could spend another week on, but you got to pick the right players to help you. And it's a very much moving world. I mean, even some of the big players more than stumble and fall. Okay.
We won't mention any names, Microsoft. I mean,
Right.
we won't bring those up whatsoever.
Right. Exactly. But so that's a good point, John. I think you have to recognize everybody's going to fall down and bruise their knee. Okay. Everybody.
Oh yeah. Agreed.
So you need to face that, but recognize you reduce that risk by picking the absolute best players, where what you need to do is just beyond your capability of your in-house staff. That's getting bigger and bigger and bigger right now, not smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and I think that's a good takeaway too, is that finding a good partner that has the experience, because I like to say experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. So, you want to find somebody who has gone through that patching process and has done the vulnerability scanning for, 5,000 or 10,000 devices. And, they know how to get you to a patch cycle for your operating systems and desktops. That's, you get criticals and highs patched in 7 days or whatever you require for your risk register. That's the kind of thing where when I ran my own shop, nobody wanted to do patching. That was like the least popular thing to do. And there are companies that are good at it. And you want to, find one of those, partner up with them, like you said, Jim, and then, let them do what they do best.
100%. But if you're going to do that, it's a fabulous strategy. But if you're going to do it, just remember you need a third-party risk management program, because you can't just sign a contract and let them run. You gotta keep your eye on them.
Amen.
Yeah. Amen. Third-party risk management is a whole separate topic, which we don't have time for today, but that's a good thing to bring up. And just to kind of summarize for folks, the main things that we talked about, getting the funding for cybersecurity. You have to be able to describe whatever project you're trying to accomplish. How does that benefit the business? And you want to find a partner, whether it's the COO or the CFO or the business, president, line of business president, whatever. You've got to be able to describe how your project is going to assist them. So you want to listen to what their pain points are and say, hey, this is how we can help with those pain points. This is how IT security is an enabler, and I'm not Captain No. So,
yep.
Any other closing thoughts? And Allan, I'll let you go first, and then Jim.
Well, thank you, John. I think you summarized it quite well. I would just emphasize the partnership aspect of the role of the CISO. You have a certain specialty, and people are dependent on that, or depending on you for that. But you got to remember that you're operating inside of a business, and you need to make sure that you're a partner to the business.
Definitely, partnerships are important and key. Jim,
that is really good, and I'll extend that a little bit and say the one partner that you absolutely positively have to have without fail is the CFO.
They control the purse strings.
Not 100%, but close enough. So has to be with you. And by the way, they know this is hard work, okay? Not like sales, for example. So they know this is hard work. So get with them and get them on your side, and you get on their side too.
And I like that idea of, stopping by the office, popping in maybe twice a week, sticking your head in the door, saying, how's it going? And make it casual. And that's a good thing. Allan and Jim, I'd like to thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today and your insight and your years of experience. Lance.
Thanks, John. And as always, thanks for joining today. Until next time, take care.